before them copies of material on our agenda today and at their place on the rostrum. And I'd like to remind our members that while the majority of the provisions of the bills before us today fall under Rule 10 jurisdiction of the Committee on Agriculture, other provisions are outside the scope of the Agriculture Committee's jurisdiction. Therefore, under House rules, we will not be considering the provisions outside the committee's jurisdiction during the markup. The committee does not have jurisdiction to vote on whether to approve or disapprove or amend provisions not within its jurisdiction, and no such vote can occur during the markup, other, of course, than to recommend amendments within the jurisdiction of the committee and to recommend the bill be passed or not passed as amended or not passed. In conclusion, members will not be voting on the entire bill for H.R. 634 or H.R. 677 or H.R. 992 or H.R. 1256. Instead, the vote will be on whether to report it to the House with recommendations on how the provisions in each bill that are in the committee's jurisdiction should be amended and as developed during the markup. With that, I recognize myself for an opening statement, and I want to thank all of you for being here for this business meeting. Today we're considering 7 bills that are common sense tweaks, and I stress the phrase tweaks, to Title VII of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. The legislation before us ensures that Dodd-Frank is implemented as Congress intended and does not unnecessarily burden our job creators. They are intended to restore the balance that I believe that can exist between sound regulation and a healthy economy. Right now, some of the proposed regulations could make using derivatives so expensive that businesses will be forced to stop using them to hedge against risk. That ultimately results in higher costs for consumers and diminished stability in the marketplace. We have an opportunity to correct those issues with legislative fixes. It's very important to note that every single bill we are considering is bipartisan, with Republican and Democrats, both on the House Agriculture Committee and on the Financial Services Committee, supporting them. Further, some of them advanced out of this committee and passed the House during the last Congress, only to languish in the Senate. We are renewing our efforts to get them back on the books. This business meeting is a step in that process, and I encourage your support for all of these bills. I now turn to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Less than a week ago, this committee held a hearing to review the legislative proposals we're considering today. And I think the testimony from CFTC Chairman Gensler reaffirmed my view that the Commission is on the right track, and I think they're going to get this mostly right. And again, say that I think it's premature to make all these changes until we know what the rules will look like at the end of the day. To me, it's best to wait until CFT has completed its rulemaking, and then, if needed, we can make improvements during the CFTC reauthorization process this summer. As I've said before, if the CFTC gets something wrong, and I'm willing to support a correction. At the same time, I do understand the Chairman's decision to bring these bills before the committee today, and although I think any action is premature, it certainly is his prerogative as Chairman. And I'm also highly doubtful that these bills will be considered in the Senate, especially given the fact that the Senate Republicans would rather eliminate Dodd-Frank altogether than to try to make it more workable. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on General Farm Commodities and Risk Management be discharged from further consideration of the bill H.R. 634. Seeing no objection, so ordered. The bill H.R. 634 is now before the committee for consideration, and without objection, the first reading of the bill will be waived and it will be open for amendment at any point. And I recognize myself for 5 minutes on H.R. 364. H.R. 634, thank you. Clerk will note the correct number. H.R. 634, the Business Risk Mitigation and Price Stabilization Act, ensures that end users can continue to use derivatives to manage business risk without being subjected to costly margin requirements. Congress never intended for end users to be subject to expensive margin requirements, which would require companies to take capital away from their businesses and hinder their ability to make the job-creating investments. I certainly want to thank Representatives Austin Scott and Representative Mike McIntyre for their efforts in making this bill possible. Representatives Grimm and Peters of the Financial Services Committee are also sponsors of this bill. With that, I turn to the ranking member for any comments he might make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just, I don't think this bill does any harm. but I just point out that, the CFTC heard us and proposed a rule that does not require any margin on uncleared swaps when non-bank swap dealers transact with non-financial end users. The problem is that the prudential regulators, the banking regulators, chose to ignore the intent of Congress, and a proposed rule that would require end users to post margins for swaps with swap dealers that are banks, created this problem. So this is a problem that's under the prudential regulator jurisdiction, and I don't know why. Well, I guess we don't have jurisdiction over them, but I'd still think it would be good if we could get them in here and ask them why they're doing what they're doing. So I don't have any problem with the bill, other than I don't think it solves this situation. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does Mr. Scott or Mr. McIntyre wish to make remarks on this bill?
Yes, sir. I would like to.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from the Carolinas.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the chairman and the ranking member for their comments. This bill would ensure that regulators do not subject end users to margin requirements that Congress did not intend. True end users like our farmers and our electric co-ops use derivatives to protect from losses and keep consumer prices stable, and they do not use derivatives to speculate for financial gain. Margin requirements on end users would have a negative impact on our economy at a time when we should be focusing on supporting our job creators and getting Americans back to work. In addition to concerns about the rise in consumer prices and shifts in the market, imposing margin on end users would also have an impact on American jobs. In fact, a 3% margin requirement on over-the-counter derivatives held by the S&P 500 companies could cut capital spending between $5.1 to $6.7 billion and cost between 100,000 and 130,000 U.S. jobs. The cost savings realized by end users frees up capital for job creation, and I tell you, my friends, every dollar that a firm does not have to spend meeting margin requirements is a dollar that is free to be used for capital investment for jobs. H.R. 634 will not apply to the major financial institutions or firms that use derivatives for speculative purposes. This legislation is critical for our farmers, for our electric co-ops, and other true end users that are not subject to margin requirements that could have negative impacts on job creation and capital investment. This bill, to help clarify Congress's intention, is critical, and certainly would ask for your support, and thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Does a gentleman from Georgia request time?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief with this. But H.R. 634 just provides the clarification that margin requirements for end users who pose no systemic risk to the financial markets are not required. I believe it's consistent with the intent of the Dodd-Frank bill that was passed, and it ensures that no undue burdens would hamper the ability to expand and create jobs from these end users. The intent last year was expressed, I think, quite well by the members of the House. The vote passed 370 to 24. Majority of the committee's members voted yes. It again makes clear the intent of Congress is that there should be no margin requirement, or in other words, a margin requirement exemption for end users who qualify for the clearing requirement exemptions. I'd like to thank Mr. McIntyre for his support on this matter. I'd appreciate an affirmative vote on this, and it is consistent with a rule that Gary Gensler said that he did believe that the CFTC would adopt this year. I think the reason that the law is needed instead of just the rule is because an agency has the ability to change the rule at any given time, and this is an opportunity for us to make sure that it's actually in the law and not changed through another rule. I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Any additional comments from other members? Seeing none.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
I have an amendment.
Let's proceed with a brief explanation from the council of the bill, and then we'll turn to amendments. Mr. Fancher. Council, would you, the chair recognize you for a brief explanation of the bill, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 634 amends the Commodity Exchange Act to clarify margin and clearing requirements shall not apply to a swap in which one of the counterparties to the swap is an end user, not a swap dealer or a major swap participant or other financial entities, and that end user is using the swap to hedge or mitigate commercial risk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to reserve a point of order.
Gentleman reserves a point of order. The council has concluded his explanation. Would the gentleman from Tennessee like to be recognized to explain his amendment, which is being distributed?
Yes, I would.
The gentleman's recognized for an explanation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment to H.R. 634 simply requires the Financial Stability Oversight Committee to conduct a study of the impacts, implementation of the credit valuation adjustment capital requirements on U.S. consumer, end users, and U.S. financial institutions. Mr. Chairman, Basel III was jointly agreed to by international regulators with jurisdictions implementing their own rules. European Basel III rules are being finalized and would provide significant exemption from CVA market risk-weighted assets for European banks. Transactions with sovereign pension funds and corporate counterparties, which are also exempt from clearing obligations, will be exempted from CVA and RWA. I have some serious questions about the impact this will have on U.S. financial institutions. To me, this exemption will provide a significant advantage to European banks, European customers, and European end users. The U.S. economy is in a fragile state. Any hurdle, fee, or foreign advantage will cost the U.S. economy valuable jobs. The decision by European regulators disregards the Basel III international agreement and will have lasting consequences for U.S. and international markets. U.S. financial institutions will be competitively disadvantaged that will affect how these institutions serve consumers and the derivative business as well as the commercial loan business. End users will see a significant impact through limited competition, which affects prices and services. Mr. Chairman, my amendment will clarify the impact Basel III CVA RWA exemption for European financial institutions will have on the U.S. economy. We can't afford to wait while Europe takes valuable market share away from U.S. companies. Mr. Chairman, I do understand, however, that how important the underlying bill is, and in order to get this legislation passed by the House and the Senate, and not wanting to complicate the process, I will withdraw this amendment. I will, however, introduce this amendment as a standalone bill to be completed in order to ensure that Basel III is implemented. The law of unintended consequences doesn't place U.S. consumers and end users at a disadvantage. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Georgia, we recognize in one moment. So, Mr. Fincher, you are withdrawing your amendment?
I'm withdrawing my amendment.
Does the gentleman from Georgia still wish to make a comment?
Yes, I'll be very brief. I would like to make just one observation, and certainly appreciate and understand Mr. Fincher will be withdrawing his amendment. But I just wanted to say that I certainly definitely support the premise of his amendment, and certainly look forward to working with him and you as well as we move this bill along over to the Financial Services Committee and to the floor. But I did want to say that just a few words on how it might affect U.S. institutions and markets. The credit value adjustment accounting rules required by Basel III, but implemented in different ways throughout the G20, have the potential to put U.S. financial institutions at a competitive disadvantage. So better international coordination is certainly the key. And I certainly think it's only appropriate that the Financial Stability Oversight Committee review this issue so we can fully understand the implications for all of the markets. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. Does the gentleman from the Carolinas wish to be recognized to address his point of order since the amendment's been withdrawn?
Since it's been withdrawn, no, we can proceed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's point of order is withdrawn. Any additional requests for recognition? Seeing none.
Chairman, I move that the bill H.R. 634 as amended be reported favorably to the House with the recommendation that it do pass.
The gentleman has a motion before the committee that 634 be moved with the recommendation of due pass. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Clearly the ayes have it, and Bill H.R. 634 is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Chair recognizes himself. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on General Farm Commodities and Risk Management be discharged from further consideration of the bill H.R. 677. Seeing no objection, so ordered. The bill H.R. 677 is now before the committee for consideration, and without objection, the first reading of the bill will be waived, and it will be open to amendment at any point. The Chair now recognizes himself for hopefully a brief opening statement. H.R. 677, the Inter-Affiliates Swap Clarification Act, acknowledges that affiliate swaps do not pose systematic risk and provides a clear exemption from redundant regulatory requirements. H.R. 677 would provide the inter-affiliate transactions when the parties to the transaction are under common control and not be regulated as swaps. The regulating inter-affiliate swaps provide no additional risk reduction, and it does substantially raise the cost for corporations. The bill ensures that the transactions between affiliates within a single corporate group are not regulated as swaps. I want to thank Ag Committee, my colleagues, Representative Chris Gibson and Representative Fudge, for their efforts to make this bill possible. And of course, Representatives Stivers and Moore on Financial Services for also sponsoring this bill. I recognize the ranking member for any comments he may have.
Chairman, I'd yield my time to the co-sponsor, Representative Fudge.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I think you've basically said it all. I just want to make clear to my colleagues that last Congress, I and my colleagues introduced similar legislation that passed the committee by voice vote, the Financial Services Committee by a vote of 53-0, and the House floor by a vote of 357-36. And I believe that given the broad consensus and bipartisan support that this issue did receive last term, I urge my colleagues to vote favorably on this sensible and much-needed legislation, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Does the gentleman seek recognition from New York?
Yes, Mr.
The
Chairman.
gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I just want to thank the Chairman, the Ranking Member, and Ms. Fudge for her leadership on this important issue. And pretty much it's all been said here, but this is really a clarification, and I think it's much needed for our end users. So I appreciate the committee's support. I yield back. Thanks.
The gentleman yields back. Do any other members have remarks on the underlying bill? Any other remarks? Seeing none, I now place an amendment in the nature of a substitute for H.R. 677, which is in each member's packet. Without objection, it will be considered as original text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize the council for a brief explanation of the substitute amendment. Proceed, council, when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 677 amends the Commodity Exchange Act to exclude from the definition of a swap transactions between affiliates for the purposes of clearing capital and margin requirements, though the transactions are required to be reported. The bill also makes clear that the authorities of the state and federal insurance regulators are preserved, as well as authorities under Sections 23A and 23B of the Federal Reserve Act. The bill also grants the Commodity Future Trading Commission anti-evasion authority and provides for expedited rulemaking. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, council. Does anyone seek recognition or additional amendments to offer? Seeing none, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your amendment in the nature of substitute adds language that I asked to be included in the previous Congress, allowing CFTC to implement the bill's changes through expedited rulemaking so that they do not need to hit the reset button. So I appreciate that, and I support the amendment.
Thank you. The question is on the amendment in the form of a substitute. All of those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do indeed have it. Chair recognizes the ranking member.
Chairman, I move that the amendment in the nature of a substitute as substitute to H.R. 677 be approved.
The question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. They do indeed have it. And the amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. The ranking member.
Chairman, I move that the bill I move that the bill H.R. 677 as amended be favorably reported to the House with the recommendation that it do pass.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 677 as amended. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed signify by saying aye. Nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. They do indeed have it. And the bill as amended is reported, will be ordered reported favorably to the House. The bill H.R. 742 is now before the committee for consideration, and without objection, a first reading of the bill will be waived and it will be open for amendment at any point. I recognize myself for a brief comment. H.R. 742, the Swap Data Repository and Clearance House Indemnification Correction Act of 2010, would strike the indemnification requirements related to both swap data gathered by swap data repositories and data collected by the Commission from clearinghouses with regard to cleared swaps. Ultimately, this bill will allow data sharing between U.S. and international regulators and swap data repositories without adding an unnecessary layer of legal bureaucracy. Indemnifications is not a legal concept in most foreign jurisdictions outside of the United States, and indemnification provisions that were not included in the House-passed version of Dodd-Frank threaten to make data sharing arrangements with foreign regulators unworkable. Global information sharing is critical to international regulators' abilities to monitor the systematic risk. And the chair wishes to thank his committee colleagues, Representative Crawford and Representative Maloney, as well as our colleagues over on the Financial Services Committee. With that, I recognize the ranking member for any comments he might have.
Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to the co-sponsor, gentleman from New York, Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I encourage my colleagues to support the measure. It's a common sense measure that would make much needed improvements, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition? Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I move like the strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just submit my comments for the record, but do want to thank my colleague, Mr. Maloney, for co-sponsoring. Appreciate it, and I urge my colleagues to adopt.
Gentleman yields back. Do any other members have remarks on the underlying bill? Seeing none, I now recognize counsel for a brief explanation of the bill. Counsel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 742 repeals the requirement that the CFTC be indemnified for any expenses arising from litigation relating to the information provided under the confidentiality provisions of Section 8 of the Commodity Exchange Act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, counsel. Are there any additional amendments to the bill? Any additional amendments? Seeing no amendments, the chair recognizes the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the bill H.R. 742 be reported favorably to the House with recommendation that it do pass.
I thank the ranking member. The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 742. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The ayes appear to have it, I should say, and the ayes do indeed have it. The bill, as amended, is ordered reported favorably to the House. The bill H.R. 1003 is now before the committee for consideration, and without objection, a first reading of the bill will be waived, and it will be open for an amendment at any point. The chair now recognizes himself, hopefully for another brief comment. This bill raises the legal standards for cost-benefit analysis, ensures that CFTC must consider the potential consequences of its actions on business. The Dodd-Frank Act is sweeping legislation that impacts every sector of the economy. Good policy requires careful consideration and analysis. I certainly want to thank my colleagues on the committee, Representative Conaway and Representative David Scott, for introducing the bill, as well as our colleagues on the Financial Services Committee, Representative Jordan and McHenry and Garrett. And with that, I would recognize the ranking member for any comment he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to the co-sponsor, gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and ranking member. I just want to make a brief statement on this and say that I'm pleased, first of all, to be joining with my colleague, Subcommittee Chairman Conaway, in supporting this bill. This bill would basically simply bring the CFTC into compliance with the President's executive order regarding cost-benefit analysis of new rules and regulations. It's very important to note that the CFTC is indeed already performing limited cost-benefit analysis, but we feel that a more robust regime laid out by this bill will result in additional, more detailed information that will precipitate more cogent action by the Commission. And as I said, these new provisions just simply mirror directives included in the President Obama's January 18th executive order improving regulation and regulatory review. And I will note, as others have, that, Mr. Chairman, that this non-controversial bipartisan bill is supported by those of us on both sides of the aisle in both Agriculture and Financial Committee, and I certainly urge my colleagues to join us in support. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? Mr. Conaway?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. I just want to simply add that first, thank David Scott and those of the other co-sponsors of the bill. This was passed last time. It is a prospective or forward-looking change to the rules at CFTC. It would not require the CFTC to go back and do cost-benefit analysis on all that broad body of work that they ignored this rule on coming under Dodd-Frank. So it would be a forward-looking change that most all other executive branch agencies have to comply with, and urge adoption. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do any other members have remarks on the underlying bill? Seeing no additional requests for time.
Chairman, I do have a statement to submit for the record, though.
And so ordered. I now turn to recognize the council for a brief explanation of the bill. Council?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 1003 amends the Commodity Exchange Act to require the CFTC, through the Office of the Chief Economist, to assess the cost and benefits of a regulation or order before it's promulgated. The added requirements contained in H.R. 1003 brings the cost-benefit analysis of the CFTC in line with the requirements of Executive Order 13563, issued on January 18, 2011. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Council. Are there any, the bill is now open for amendment. Are there any amendments? I seeing none, I recognize the ranking member for a motion.
Chairman, I move that the bill H.R. 1003 be reported favorably to the House with recommendation that it do pass.
The question is on the motion by the ranking member to favorably report H.R. 1003. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. Nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. They do indeed have it. And the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. We now turn to the bill H.R. 1038, which is before the committee for consideration. And without objection, the first reading of the bill will be waived, and it will be open to amendment for amendment at any point. With that, I recognize myself for an opening statement. H.R. 1038, the Public Power Risk Management Act, would allow producers, utility companies, and other non-financial entities to continue entering into energy swaps with government-owned utilities without danger of being required to register with the CFTC as a swap dealer, solely because of their dealings with government-owned utilities. Utility special entities should be allowed to keep using traditional swap counterparties to help manage their risk related to the generation of electricity or the production of natural gas. To hinder these utilities' ability to manage risk would only increase their cost and possibly lead to higher energy rates for millions of Americans, an unacceptable result during a period of tremendous economic uncertainty. I certainly want to thank my colleagues on the committee, Representatives Lamalfa, Denham, Garamundi, and Costa for introducing this bill, as well as our colleague on financial services and former member of the committee, Mr. Luptemeyer. With that, I recognize the ranking member for any comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, co-sponsor of the bill.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you said it very well. This simply allows these publicly owned utilities to continue to operate as they have in the past without having to meet this requirement, which would cost them a lot of money and slow down their ability to handle their risk management. And we support the bill, and it's important for those publicly owned utilities throughout the nation, and certainly in Mr. Lamoff's in my district. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the other gentleman from California seek recognition on the bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman,
Recognized.
and ranking member, as well as members of the committee. I appreciate the bipartisan support here of my colleagues, the initial sponsors on the bill, Mr. Garamendi, Mr. Denham, Costa, and Luxemeier, as well as our additional co-sponsors that have come on board here recently. It's a very common sense measure. I think that, with so much of our power, especially in rural America, coming from public power, it's important as Ag Committee members that we have this tool to keep power available at the best possible price. So I appreciate the support. Also want to shout out to my staff member, Miss Allison Cook, for doing a great job of managing this bill for us, and so I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do any other members have remarks on the underlying bill? Seeing none, I now recognize counsel for a brief explanation of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 1038 amends the Commodity Exchange Act by clarifying that transactions and utility operations related swaps shall be reported and counted towards an entity's de minimis calculation established in law, not a sub-threshold established for special entities created in regulation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, counsel. The bill is now open for amendment. Seeing no request in regards to an amendment, I now turn to the ranking member for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the bill H.R. 1038 be reported favorably to the House with the recommendation that it do pass.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 1038. All in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes appear to have it. They do indeed have it. The bill is ordered reported favorably to the House. The bill H.R. 1256 is now before the committee for consideration, and without objection, a first reading of the bill will be waived and it will be open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for some comments. H.R. 1256, the Swap Jurisdiction Certainty Act, will direct the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission to adopt a joint rule on how they will regulate cross-border swap transactions as a part of the new requirement created in the Dodd-Frank Act. Any cross-border rule jointly issued by the two agencies must go through a formal rulemaking process subject to the Administrative Procedures Act. No guidance from either commission will have the force of law. H.R. 1256 will ensure that foreign countries with broadly equivalent regulatory regimes are allowed to govern derivatives transactions within their own borders using the CFTC and SEC unless the CFTC and SEC determine they are not honoring the 2009 G20 commitments to enact financial regulatory reforms surrounding the trading of derivatives. I certainly want to express my thank you and appreciation to my colleagues, Representative Conaway and Representative Scott, for introducing this bill, as well as our colleagues over on Financial Services, Mr. Garrett and Mr. Carney. And with that, I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I think this is premature, it's a far better approach than what was considered in the previous Congress, and I would yield to Mr. Scott, one of the co-sponsors.
Gentleman yields to the gentleman from Georgia. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member. Very briefly, Mr. Chairman, I just want to offer my very strong support for this legislation, H.R. 1256, the Swap Jurisdiction Certainty Act, which seeks to address an issue that I have continuously raised in this committee and in my other committee in Financial Services, and that is the extraterritorial application of Dodd-Frank rules. H.R. 1256 would very simply mandate that the CFTC and the SEC work together to create a joint rule through the regular rulemaking process rather than guidance to delineate the circumstances under which Dodd-Frank rules apply to transactions between the United States and non-U.S. persons. Furthermore, the bill deems that a non-U.S. person who is subject to the jurisdiction of a G20 regulatory regime is exempt from U.S. swap requirements. However, in a nod to the fact that not all G20 nations are created equal, and some do a better job of regulating their markets than others, our bill allows the CFTC and the SEC to jointly determine that the rules should in fact apply to a particular nation. I understand that there are some who have concerns about reimportation of risk from other nations. However, Mr. Chairman, I do not share those concerns. It would seem that with the application of clearing and margin requirements, as well as swap dealer and major swap participant registration and reporting requirements, would certainly prevent any risk reimportation and forestall another AIG-like market failure. And yet, the cost of such extraterritorial application would be quite substantial, not to mention the risk to U.S. competitiveness in this space. So I'm pleased that the committee is considering this bipartisan bill today, and I would certainly ask my colleagues to join me in voting in favor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This is the gentleman from Texas see recognition.
I need to strike this word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a longer statement to submit for the record. Two things I'd like to point out, in addition to what my good colleague, Mr. Scott, talked about, is that while it includes the G20, it also allows the CFTC and the SEC to designate other foreign jurisdictions to be able to apply it under these exemptions. And as he said, it would force the two agencies to actually work together. They've not demonstrated throughout this entire 3-year period since Dodd-Frank was passed a real keen interest in working together. And we've provisions in the law to get around the kind of gamesmanship that each agency has played against the other to try to avoid working together. I'd also note that the packet, the bill in your packet, is missing page 2, and we will fix that. And that there's a typo in one of the sections that will also get fixed later. With that, I yield back.
You are always a methodical CPA, sir. Thank you very much. The gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to make remarks on the underlying bill? Seeing no request for time, the chair now recognizes counsel for a brief explanation of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 1256 requires the CFTC and the SEC to engage in a joint rulemaking setting forth the application of U.S. swap requirements to transactions involving non-U.S. persons. The commissions must consider the nature of the connections to the U.S., which of the U.S. swap requirements shall apply to the activities of non-U.S. persons, and the circumstances under which a non-U.S. person, in compliance with the regulatory requirements of a foreign jurisdiction, shall be exempt from the U.S. swap requirements. H.R. 1256 formalizes a schedule for the joint rulemaking and requires the commissions to report to Congress any determination that a foreign jurisdiction is not broadly equivalent to the U.S. swaps requirements and articulate the basis for such determination within 30 days. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, counsel. The bill is now open for amendment. Are there amendments? Seeing no amendments, I now recognize the ranking member for a motion.
Chairman, I move that the bill H.R. 1256 be reported favorably to the House with recommendation that it do pass.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.R. 1256. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do indeed have it, and the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. The bill H.R. 992 is now before the committee for consideration, and without objection, a first reading of the bill will be waived, and it will be open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for a set of comments. H.R. 992 amends Section 716 of the Dodd-Frank Act to limit the swap desk push-out requirements so that it does not apply to equity or commodity swaps. But it will continue to be applied to structured financial swaps that are based on asset-backed securities. Identical legislation has been introduced in the Senate, S. 474, and sponsored by the Senators Hagan, Toomey, Warner, and Johans. I want to thank my Ag Committee colleagues, Representative Hudson and Maloney, for introducing this bill, as well as our former colleague on the committee over on financial services, Mr. Hultgren, and Mr. Hines. And with that, I recognize the ranking member for any comments he might offer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must strongly oppose H.R. 992, commonly known as the swap push-out bill. Compared to what Section 716 originally called for when the Senate first enacted its version of Dodd-Frank, 716 in its current form is a modest reform that should not be gutted as H.R. 992 would accomplish. I have two articles here that I'd like to make part of the record that illustrate the problem.
They'll be added to the record.
One is a Bloomberg story. It's titled "Bank of America Said to Split Regulators Over Moving Merrill Derivatives to Bank Unit." The other is a New York Post article titled "Sleight of Hand, Bank of America Moves Dodgy Merrill Derivatives to Bank." And appreciate you making them part of the record. In 2011, the Bank of America reportedly moved trillions, not billions, but trillions of dollars worth of derivative contracts from its Merrill Lynch unit into its retail bank unit. The retail bank unit is home to trillions of dollars on deposit from everyday Americans. According to the articles, this move greatly concerned the FDIC, which would be required to pay off depositors in the event the derivatives led to banks' failure. The Federal Reserve, which would not be on the hook for as the FDIC would, reportedly supported the transfer. Personally, I question whether these types of transfers should be permitted at all, and question how much we should permit banks that hold customer deposits to engage in swap activity. Section 716, as originally passed in the Senate, would have forced almost all swap activity out of insured depository institutions. Section 716 in its current form only requires that banks spin off their business in commodity swaps, such as energy and agriculture swaps, non-cleared and non-investment grade credit default swaps on asset-backed securities, and equity swaps. Combined, these swaps represent a very small part of the swaps market. Banks can continue swap activity if the swaps are directly related to the business of banking. According to the Bank for International Settlement, those types of swaps, primarily interest rate and foreign exchange, which comprise about 90% of the swap market. And apparently 90% is not good enough for some of these big banks, so passing H.R. 992 would allow them to keep playing in 99% of the swap market, which is pretty much a status quo. Proponents of H.R. 992 warn of the increased cost to banks required to spin off their swap business into separate affiliates, which would need to be capitalized. This is understandable because the affiliate would be denied public subsidy through access to taxpayer-supported safety net. The affiliate could not run to the Federal Reserve when it got into trouble or get access to cheap loans. And frankly, after our experience with TARP and the financial collapse of 2008, I think the American people are tired of banks running to the federal government when they get in trouble. Not because of their banking activity, but because of their trading activities. In April of 2012, J.P. Morgan Chase lost at least $6.2 billion because of its dealings in derivatives. Just last Friday, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations released a report detailing how this occurred, how the bank misled investigators, regulators, investors, and the general public. The report detailed how a bank considered the model for stability turned out to be not so stable. In my opinion, it doesn't make any sense to consider legislation to allow banks to play more in the swap markets before we have all these answers. I voted against TARP in 2008 because I didn't think the federal government should be bailing out banks for a mess that they made themselves. I supported Section 716, because I do not want the federal government bailing out or subsidizing bank activity that is not related to the business of banking. And I urge my colleagues to oppose H.R. 992 so that we don't put more taxpayer dollars at risk from bank swap activity not related to banks' banking business. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and before I recognize my colleagues, by unanimous consent, I would like to submit for the record 7 letters from various chambers of commerce and end-user entities in support of the various pieces of legislation. Seeing no objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman,
gentleman from Georgia seeks recognition.
Yes, I
Gentleman's
would.
recognized.
And let me say just that the ranking member certainly raises some very, very serious and concerning points that I certainly respect tremendously. But I do have some concerns about this, as having worked on this bill in both the Financial Services and the Agriculture Committee. And so I'd just like to point out, number one, that I offer my voice of support for H.R. 92, and I want to explain very carefully why. I have always been concerned in dealing with Dodd-Frank, and I am a sponsor of Dodd-Frank. I worked to get Dodd-Frank passed. It is an extraordinarily important piece of legislation. But I've also been always concerned about unintended consequences. And that's why I have this consideration. That's why I support this. It does alter Dodd-Frank, the provision, namely Section 716. But, ladies and gentlemen, that was never given proper consideration in the House during the initial development of Dodd-Frank. And as I said, it could have substantial negative unintended consequences. Now, while the systemic risk mitigation goals of Section 716 of Dodd-Frank are certainly laudable, I have some serious questions that forcing swaps out of banks into affiliates, as Section 716 would require, is indeed the best way to accomplish this. I think there's another way. On the contrary, it could lead to less and lower quality capital in the affiliate, thereby actually increasing risk. It would also increase cost and complexity for the customers of the banks, who would prefer to do their swaps business and offset credit risk with the same entity. These are some serious concerns that, as we work this through, I'm sure this will give us a chance to address more fully. But like the rest of the bills before us today, the language we are hopefully approving is the product of careful, bipartisan consideration. And as I said, this bill is working through Agriculture and Financial Services, a negotiation that stretches back to last Congress. And it involves not only this committee, as I said, but also our Committee on Financial Services as well. It is definitely not, nor would I be a part of, any effort to repeal Section 716. And it is not a piecemeal dismantling of Dodd-Frank, nor would I ever be a part of this. What this is to try to get a very narrow fit, a narrow tailoring of one section of a very large bill, and a change that, in my opinion, is simply warranted. So I urge my colleagues to just join us in support of this. Let's work it through. I'm sure we will get to a very good conclusion in the end that will certainly be beneficial to both our institutions and the customers that they serve. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak in support of H.R. 992, the Swaps Regulatory Improvement Act, which my colleague Sean Patrick Maloney and I are working on together, along with our colleagues on the Financial Services Committee. As my colleagues are aware, this bipartisan bill amends a provision in the Dodd-Frank Act which sought to prevent risky swap activities of banks from being eligible for a federal bailout via FDIC insurance or capital infusions from the Federal Reserve. While we believe this provision was proposed in good faith, it simply does not prevent the risk that its authors intended. Moreover, this provision would likely increase systemic risk and will cause many American financial institutions to operate at a significant disadvantage to their foreign competitors. Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, who's also chairman of the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board, and former FDIC Chairman Sheila Bair have all raised concerns about Section 716. Also in the last Congress, the House Financial Services Committee Democrat members, including former Chairman Frank and current Chairman Maxine Waters, endorsed our bill's predecessor, H.R. 1838, agreeing that this measure, quote, address the valid criticisms of Section 716 without, and I quote, weakening the financial reform law's important derivative safeguards or prohibitions on bank proprietary trading. Mr. Chairman, to echo what Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke said at a hearing on February 27th, and I quote, it was not evident that Section 716 makes the company as a whole safer. And what we do see is that it will likely increase cost of people who use derivatives and make it more difficult for the bank to compete with foreign competitors who can provide a more complete set of services, end quote. I ask my colleagues to support this bipartisan bill, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? The chair recognizes the ranking member.
Thank the gentleman. I beg the committee's indulgence for another half minute here. Two of the worst votes I ever made in this place was the Commodity Modernization Act of 2000 that exempted all of these swaps from any regulation or any margins. I didn't know any better. The other vote I made that was really bad was eliminating Glass-Steagall. We should have never done that, and I bought into that. If we had Glass-Steagall back, this wouldn't be an issue. So just understand what you're doing here. 90% of this swap market is already exempt. This is going to bring it to 99%. And you're putting the taxpayers on the hook. And if you want to do that, fine. But, I mean, when a lot of us were here, we hadn't paid enough attention, and this thing blew up on us. At the time we did the Modernization Act, there were $80 billion in swaps or in derivatives. We gave them legal certainty. We eliminated the the regulation requirements, and it went to $700 trillion, and it blew up on us. So just be careful. You can vote any way you want, but this could come back and haunt you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, the chair now recognizes counsel for a brief explanation of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 992 allows covered depository institutions to trade swaps with counterparties, except for certain structured finance swaps, unless they are for hedging or risk management purposes or expressly permitted by prudential regulators to take place in covered depository institutions. The bill also ensures that uninsured U.S. branches and agency of foreign banks are treated the same as insured depository institutions by defining both groups as covered depository institutions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, counsel. And the bill is now open for amendment. Are there any amendments? Seeing no amendments, do any members wish to make any additional comments? Seeing none, I recognize the chairman of the General Farm Commodities and Risk Management Subcommittee for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the bill H.R. 992 be reported favorably to the House with a recommendation that it do pass.
Chairman.
The gentleman's made a motion. The ranking member requests a recorded vote.
I do.
The recorded vote is so ordered. The question will be on the motion to favorably report H.R. 992 to the House of Representatives. The clerk will call the roll when ready.
Mr. Goodlatte. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway, aye. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, aye. Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Gibbs, aye. Mr. Austin Scott. Mr. Austin Scott, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford, aye. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Desjardins. Mr. Desjardins, aye. Mr. Gibson. Mr. Gibson, aye. Mrs. Hartzler? Mrs. Hartzler, aye. Mr. Ribble? Mr. Ribble, aye. Mrs. Nome? Mrs. Nome, aye. Mr. Benishek? Mr. Benishek, aye. Mr. Denham? Mr. Denham, aye. Mr. Fincher? Mr. Fincher, aye. Mr. LaMalfa? Mr. LaMalfa, aye. Mr. Hudson? Mr. Hudson, aye. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Yoho? Mr. Yoho, aye. Mr. Peterson? Mr. Peterson, no. Mr. McIntyre? Mr. McIntyre, aye. Mr. David Scott? Mr. David Scott, aye. Mr. Costa? Mr. Costa, no. Mr. Walls? Mr. Walls, no. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader, no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. McGovern? Mr. McGovern, no. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, no. Mrs. Negrete McLeod? Mrs. Negrete McLeod, no. Mr. Vella? Mr. Vella, no. Ms. Lujan Grisham?
No.
Ms. Lujan Grisham, no. Ms. Custer?
Yes. Yay.
Ms. Custer, yay. Mr. Nolan?
No.
Mr. Nolan, no. Mr. Gallego?
Aye.
Mr. Gallego, aye. Mr. Inyart?
No.
Mr. Inyart, no. Mr. Vargas?
Aye.
Mr. Vargas, aye. Ms. Bustos?
No.
Ms. Bustos, no. Mr. Maloney?
Aye.
Mr. Maloney, aye. Mr. Courtney?
No.
Mr. Courtney, no. Mr. Garamendi?
No.
Mr. Garamendi, no. Mr. Goodlatte?
Aye.
Mr. Goodlatte, aye. Fudge. Ms. Fudge?
Does the clerk have one more name to call?
Mr. Chairman?
Aye. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
It's obviously been a while since we've done roll call votes. Does any member wish to be recorded or to change their recorded vote? Seeing no request, the clerk may report the vote when it is ready.
The vote is 31 yeas to 14 nays. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Does any member have any additional notice of intention to file supplemental, minority, or additional views to any of the bills considered today? Without objection, the usual instructions are given to staff that consist of making such technical, clarifying, and confirming changes as are appropriate without changing the substance of the legislation. The meeting is now adjourned.